Well, again, we're happy to see each and every one this morning. I apologize for being a little bit late this morning. I told Matthew that I was not just skipping out on his class. I was waiting at the hospital as long as I could, hoping one of the doctors would come around. But as usual on weekends, you know, they're a little bit slower sometimes. But anyway, Faye has been having some last several days some very serious abdominal pain, and so we went up to ER last night, and they admitted her and trying to figure out what's going on. So I stayed up there as long as I could, but maybe they will figure out what's going on. And I know what some of you are thinking. I'd have pain too if I had to live with you. Just go ahead and say it, you know, get it over with, get done with it. But anyway, open up to 2 Corinthians chapter 4 and verse number 7. I did this lesson, at least in part, down at Shrigley back in the summer, and some of you were down there, and I don't remember who it was, and I forget even what service I did it. And so I thought after the lesson that I did last Sunday night here on dealing with struggles that we have versus happiness, how can we be happy with the struggles that we have in life, I got to thinking about it, and I thought, well, let me go back and pull this lesson out. Because I think it goes very well with what we talked about last Sunday evening. And so I will, if you happen to hear it down at Shrigley, don't go to sleep. Listen again. Okay, but is that fair enough? But anyway, 2 Corinthians chapter 4, the Apostle Paul had this to say, "For our light affliction, which is but for a moment, worketh for us a far more exceeding and eternal weight of glory." Now, Paul is writing to the brethren at Corinth. He's writing to Christian people like you. And he's simply making a point that afflictions are things or something that we all face in life. Notice the word Paul uses, all, in that verse. For our light affliction. He puts himself in the context there. Our light affliction. And also, again, I remind you that he's writing to Christian people, implying and indicating and actually teaching that just because we become Christians, members of the Lord's church, that does not exclude us from facing afflictions in our life, does it? We have them just as well as others. You know, it's so easy sometimes to feel that when we are suffering, when we are struggling, the word I used last Sunday night, to feel that, you know, I'm the only one that's having to deal with something like this. Have you ever felt that way? You know? Why me, in other words? Why is this happening to me? You remember back in 1 Kings chapter 18, I'll not go back there and read that for time's sake because we're probably all familiar with the context, where Elijah was fleeing from that wicked woman Jezebel. You know, Jezebel had ordered all the prophets to be slain, to be killed. And Elijah, being a prophet of God, was fleeing from her. He was trying to escape for his life and get away from this wicked woman, the wife of Ahab. We talk about the wickedness of Ahab, and I tell you what, folks, I don't know whether he was any more wicked than his wife or not. They were both pretty evil, were they not? And so Elijah is escaping for his life, and he gets off and he begins to think that, you know, I am the only one that's having to deal with this. I'm the only one left. Why me? Look what God said back in 1 Kings chapter 19 rather. 1 Kings chapter 19 and verse number 18. Now keep in mind that Elijah is off by himself. And I guess we could say that, putting it in modern day terminology, as we might say, and you've probably said it, I know I have a lot of times, Elijah was really down in the dumps. He was hurting. He was struggling. And you talk about a man that was facing affliction, Elijah surely was. Try to put yourself in Elijah's shoes. Alone. But notice what God said to him in 1 Kings chapter 19 and verse number 18. Chapter 19 and verse 18. God says, "Yet I have left me 7,000 in Israel, all the knees which have not bowed unto Baal, and every mouth which has not kissed him." You know what God is really telling Elijah? Elijah, you're not alone. You're not the only one that's facing what you are facing. I have others likewise. So I brought that in to simply say that it really does not matter what our struggle, what our afflictions are. We're not alone. We're not by ourselves. I've said a lot of times, you may have heard me say this down through the years, it really does not matter what my affliction is, what my problem is, what I'm having to deal with in life. I don't have to look very far to find someone who is worse off than I am. There's something that made an impression on my mind a number of years ago that I will never, ever forget. You know, there are certain things that just gives you that impression. You just cannot remove it from your memory. I was preaching back in the early 80s over in Sardis, Mississippi, about 50 miles south of Memphis. And my next door neighbor was a World War II vet, and he was shot up and had heart conditions, and he used the VA, the Veterans Hospital up in Memphis. And I don't know how many times, I could not tell you how many times Mr. Vickery, wife would call me and she would say, can you take, and I forget his first name, are you where you could run him to Memphis? He is really struggling. I'd usually say, give me just a few minutes. And I would go down and pick him up, take him to Memphis to the VA hospital and go in there with him. Folks, if you really want to see something that will open your eyes, just go through a veterans hospital sometimes and see people who have been shot up. See people where one side of their face is literally just torn off. I've seen it. See people who are sitting in a wheelchair with nothing in their body from here down, just like a partial stump with a head on it sitting there. I've seen it. No arms. I will never, ever get that impression out of my mind. The first time I went, it tore me up, to tell you the truth about it. So I said that to say this. It really does not matter what I'm having to deal with, brethren. I promise you there's always somebody, and probably not very far from us, that are having to deal with something maybe even worse. That was Elijah, you see. And so there is comfort in knowing that it doesn't matter what my afflictions are, there is comfort in knowing that others who are faithfully serving God, who are facing some of the same issues in life. Look at what Peter said in 1 Peter chapter 5 and verse 9. 1 Peter chapter 5 and verse 9. And keep in mind where we started in this lesson, our light affliction, which is but for a moment, worketh for us a far more exceeding and eternal weight of glory. Keep that passage in the back of your mind. In 1 Peter chapter 5 and verse 9, Paul says, in verse 8 he talks about the devil, that roaring lion. Verse 9 he says, whom resist, steadfast in the faith. What's this? Knowing that the same afflictions are accomplished in your brethren that are in the world. Paul, Brother Peter, simply saying, you brethren, you're facing some of the same things that are in the world. Just because you're a Christian does not exclude you from affliction. Now, notice the terminology. Go back to our text, 2 Corinthians chapter 4 and verse 7. Paul says, our light affliction. The word light simply means suffering is not really heavy. It is not so heavy that you cannot bear it. That's the idea of the word light. Now, we may ask, what type of suffering is light? That may be going through your mind right now. What type of suffering, what type of affliction is really light? We need to understand that the Apostle Paul, I guess you could say, was somewhat of an expert when it came to dealing with affliction. He was, I guess you could really say that he was an expert in dealing with that. Look over in the 2 Corinthians, down in verse number chapter 4 and verse number 8. Just back up just a little bit in that same chapter. 2 Corinthians chapter 4, we started with verse 17, but back up to verse number 8 and lead into verse 17. And then as we read verses 8 and following, ask yourself the question, would I really consider this being light? Would I really consider this being more than I could handle? Verse number 8, Paul said, we are troubled on every side, yet not distressed. We are perplexed, but not in despair. Persecuted, but not forsaken. Cast down, but not destroyed. Always bearing about in the body the dying of the Lord Jesus, that life also of Jesus might be made manifest in my body. For we which live are always delivered unto death for Jesus' sake, that the life also of Jesus might be made manifest in our mortal flesh. So then death worketh in us, but life in you. Paul is simply saying everywhere we face, everywhere we turn, we're facing problems and even death. And Paul, you would still come along and say, those are light afflictions? That's hard for me to grasp. What about you? That's hard for me to grasp. What about you? Man, if I face what Paul had to face, I don't know, brethren, whether my faith would have been strong enough to keep it going or not. I would have said, if this is what being a Christian is all about, I think I need to go a different direction. But not Paul. I read in preparing this lesson, I don't know, some of you probably heard over the years, late years, long ago, the late brother Thomas Warren preach. I know that some of you who got some of my books, maybe debate books, when I was getting rid of them back in 2017, I had some debate books up there by Brother Thomas B. Warren. Great gospel preacher, great writer. And I ran across this statement. He said this, writer, defender of the truth, he made this observation. This is a quote. He said, suffering is light compared to what Jesus endured. Suffering is light compared to what we really deserve. And suffering is light compared to the glories of heaven. End of quote. And brethren, I thought that was one of the greatest statements that could ever be made on 2 Corinthians chapter 4 and verse 17. I really like what he said, light compared to the glories of heaven. And I'm sure that's the way that the Apostle Paul looked at it. Suffering, affliction really has the inclination of drawing us closer to God, really. There are a lot of people who have been restored to the Lord, restored to Christ over the years, really, because of suffering and affliction. Look over in chapter 12 of 2 Corinthians just a moment. I think that we have some words again by the Apostle Paul that we can really take to heart when it comes to dealing with afflictions or struggles. As I said earlier, this is just sort of expanding a little bit on our lesson last Sunday night. In 2 Corinthians chapter 12, beginning with verse 7. 2 Corinthians chapter 12 and verse number 7. Paul says, unless I should be exalted above measure, through the abundance of the revelation, there was given me a thorn in the flesh, the messenger of Satan to buffet me, lest I should be exalted above measure. In other words, keep me humble, Paul says. For this thing I besought the Lord thrice or 3 times that it might depart from me. And he said unto me, my grace is sufficient for thee, for my strength is made perfect in weakness. Most gladly, therefore, will I rather glory in mine infirmities, that the power of Christ may rest upon me. Therefore I take pleasure in infirmities, in reproaches, in necessities, in persecutions, in distress for Christ's sake. Now what's this last phrase? For when I am weak, then am I strong. Paul says, there are things that I deal with, there are afflictions, that he mentioned some of them, and he said, these things, when I deal with them, will really make me stronger. You know, and I know of people, maybe you have done it yourself, maybe you have experienced it. Maybe when we battled afflictions and we won the battle, we feel good about it. It may be emotional, it may be financial, it may be physical, it may be spiritual, whatever it may be. When we win the battle, number one, we feel better about ourselves, don't we, folks? And it makes us stronger. And Paul says there was that thorn in my flesh. I don't know what that was. Do you? Now, if you really know what that was, I want you to tell me after the lesson today. I mean, I've heard about everything over the years. God doesn't tell us. Paul didn't tell us. But he said it was there to buffet me, to discipline me, to keep me humble. And I asked the Lord, Lord, can you not take this away? Lord, can't you remove this from me? God says, I'm not going to remove it, Paul. But here's what I'll do. I'll give you something so strong and so good and so powerful, it'll help you deal with it. And that's my grace. My grace is sufficient for thee. You know what Paul, or what God is really telling Paul? God is really telling him, Paul, I am going to help you deal with this thing. I'm going to help you through this. Have you ever said or heard somebody say, without the help of God, I could not have made it? Maybe you've said it yourself. Folks, I think that's what Paul is telling us in 2 Corinthians chapter 4. But notice one more quick point in that, our light affliction. 2 Corinthians chapter 4 and verse 17. He says, which is but for a moment. You know, sometimes our affliction seems like an eternity, does it not? When in the world is it going to end? How long am I going to have to deal with this? How long am I going to have to bear this? Remember what Job said in Job chapter 14 and verse 1? Man that is born of woman is a few days and full of trouble. And Job knew what he was talking about, didn't he? I mean, he was troubled. He was afflicted. But for a moment. You know, if we live for 200 years, well, and if we suffered affliction every day of that 200 years, it would be but a moment compared to eternity. Compared to eternity. And that's what Paul is looking forward to, you see, the glories of heaven. And then he finishes with that statement in verse 17, 2 Corinthians 4, for our light affliction, which is but for a moment, worketh for us a far more exceeding and eternal weight of glory. Think about the Lord, what he had to endure. Think about his affliction. But where is he now? Where is he now? On the right hand of God. And Paul says, it worketh for us. The idea, it helps keep us humble, as is already said earlier in this chapter. It helps keep us humble. As he said in chapter 12, as we read a few moments ago, about that thorn in the flesh. It's there to buffet us. It's there to keep us strong. It's there to help us rely more and more and more every day on the Lord. And the more we rely on the Lord, the stronger we're going to be spiritually, and the stronger we are spiritually, the stronger we are in dealing with our affliction. And that's what Paul is saying in verse number 17. So, you know, when you look at it this way, affliction might not be too bad, right? If it makes us stronger, if it keeps us humble, and if it helps us more and more every day to rely on the Lord and realize how gracious God is, how good God is, how powerful God is, and how present God is with all that we have to deal with, He's there to help us. So it might not really be that bad after all. You know, when we look at it that way. But it's hard to look at it that way, isn't it? It's tough to look at it that way. Now, folks, it's my conviction that that's the way Paul is looking at it. In 2 Corinthians chapter 4 and verse number 17. So I hope these things will help us, and, you know, we all deal with it. We face it. But maybe it'll help us be stronger. And I don't know about you. I can't answer for you. But I know one person who has a lot of room to grow spiritually. Could you guess who I'm talking about? Could anybody guess who I'm talking about? I'm talking about the man standing right here. I have a lot of room for spiritual growth. And so these things help me look at things that way, and I hope they do you too. That's our study this morning. Are you a Christian? Are you really a Christian? Do you believe that Jesus Christ is the Son of God? Do you really believe that? Do you really believe that you sinned, that you need to repent of your sins? Are you ready to confess your faith? Yes, I believe that Jesus Christ is the Son of God. Are you ready to be baptized into Christ? Not as a baptism to show that you've already been saved, like so many people teach today, but one that washes away sin, and a baptism that puts you into Jesus Christ. Galatians chapter 3, verse 26 and 27. If you haven't done that, you could do it today. I came by the building one day this past week. I don't remember what day it was, and Philip was in here cleaning, and the water was doing in here. I know it's all ready to go. If you've done that, but you haven't been faithful to God, and you know you haven't served Him faithfully, think about your life. Think about the brevity of life. And think about the eternity of life to follow. If you need to make amends to God because of unfaithfulness, be restored, what better time that you could have than right now?